The ancient philosophers, Aristotle, Diogenes, Cicero, Seneca, and many others, all of them are fairly well known for their works, but as fancy as all of that philosophizing was, how did they actually earn a living? How did an ancient philosopher pay the bills? Well, there are many answers, and circumstances were often individual, but there were several common ways that philosophers made their living, and shockingly, they were largely determined by the philosophers' own beliefs. The first way that philosophers could make a living was by giving lessons and instructions. It wasn't just philosophy that would be taught, though. Rhetoric and other topics like mathematics were also included. The hope, or at least the sales pitch, was that philosophers would teach their students to be virtuous, competent leaders who would run their families' estates competently. This way of earning a living was often criticized by other philosophers, since selling knowledge was seen as immoral. The second way was simple. They'd beg. You see, many philosophers weren't very wealthy, would often take to the streets begging for food or money. The most famous example of this is, of course, Diogenes, who was homeless and even briefly lived in a jar, and he would often berate people on the streets until they paid him. He and other philosophers were often given accommodation and food in the houses of wealthy friends who wanted to hear what they had to say. And the third way they made money was perhaps the most common. They'd find a wealthy patron. Now, this could take several forms. Sometimes a wealthy benefactor would leave a very large sum of money to a philosopher they liked the work of. Another way is demonstrated by the philosopher Epicurus. He wrote of the time he approached a potential patron and goaded him into becoming his supporter. He asked why he would entrust his body to a doctor, his horses to an Avenel, but not his soul and virtuous well-being to a philosopher. A fair point perhaps, but it ended with Epicurus getting punched in the face and then patron. He became a teacher instead. Way number 4 was to become an on-hand philosopher. Aristotle, for instance, was a personal advisor to Alexander the Great, who would be kept on call for whenever the king had a question. And Seneca acted as the political advisor to Emperor Nero. These were often very lucrative positions, but were also quite dangerous, since monarchs weren't the most easy of patrons. And the fifth way was that they already had jobs and would philosophize on the side. Cicero, for example, was a lawyer, a Roman senator, and a consul, and his philosophy was often tied to public service. Whereas Marcus Aurelius made his living by, being the emperor. So to summarize, it shouldn't surprise you that in the days of subsistence farming, thinking for a living wasn't really a viable, well-paid career for most. It was largely down to the patronage of the wealthy that ancient philosophers could spend as much time philosophizing as they did. So how did ancient philosophers make their money? Some had jobs, some begged for scraps, and many were kept,